Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to America House. My name is Christiane Hoffland. I'm the director of America House. It's really a pleasure to have you all here this evening. And tonight we have an incredible opportunity to hear from the Honorable Ambassador Paula Dobriansky. She's an accomplished foreign policy expert and a specialist in the areas of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. During her more than 25 years in national security affairs, Ambassador Dobriansky held many senior-level positions in the U.S. government, including Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, Associate Director for Policy and Programs at the U.S. Information Agency, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, Director of European and Soviet Affairs at the National Security Council in the White House. Since 2009, she served as Senior Fellow at the Harvard University John F. Kennedy School of Government. From 1997 to 2001, she served as a Senior Vice President and Director of the Washington Office of the Council of Foreign Relations and was the first George F. Kennan Senior Fellow for Russian and Eurasian Studies. She graduated from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Affairs and holds an MA and a PhD in Soviet political military affairs from Harvard University. Not only that, but Ambassador Dobriansky was raised in a Ukrainian-American family and is a great advocate for Ukraine. So today we have the chance to hear her thoughts on the important role of civil society and social activism in eradicating corruption and bringing about economic reforms to Ukraine. It's really an honor for us to hear from Dobriansky today, so please join me in giving her a warm America House welcome.
Добрый день, and good evening, everyone. I'm very delighted to be here this evening, and I first want to thank IREX because America House is one of IREX's programs, and I'm very pleased that IREX has brought me here to Ukraine. It's a real pleasure and a real treat for me. I also am delighted to be here at America House and to see all of you. I am especially pleased and grateful to have this chance to speak with you at this, I think, very important time in Ukraine. And as I look around the room and see each and every one of you, I have to say that you represent the next generation of Ukrainians, and your voice is crucial in the future direction of Ukraine. I want to focus my remarks tonight on the very practical, concrete things that Ukrainians can do to build a free and strong foundation in your country. I firmly believe that Ukraine's future is in the hands of civil society. You obviously have a very important stake in your country's future. And with the right focus, you can take the lead in making Ukraine a thriving, prosperous democracy integrated with the West. And the good news, at least I believe, is that you are building on a solid foundation of a very rich and inspiring history, and also a challenging history, but an inspiring one. This is a history that's deeply personal to me. As Christina mentioned, I am of Ukrainian descent, and I'm very proud of my heritage. For those of you who have visited the United States and you're familiar with the Ukrainian-American diaspora, it's a very strong one. It's one that's very committed to the future here of Ukraine. Both of my parents instilled in me the importance of knowing and understanding my roots. My father was a Ukrainian-American activist during the time of the Cold War. And as I look around and see many of you, there are some of you who maybe were just born during that period and maybe others not. Well, one of his proudest achievements was his involvement with the establishment of a monument in Washington, D.C. for the renowned Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko. With President Eisenhower's support, a statue of Shevchenko was erected in 1964. And that's just a few miles away from the White House and the State Department, and also many of the embassies, foreign embassies in our capital. The statue sent a very important message about the culture, the history, and identity of the Ukrainian nation. Shevchenko's work underscored the determination of the Ukrainian people to survive and prevail in the face of repeated brutal efforts to subjugate their country. And also a history marked by no shortage of betrayal, suffering, and partitions. Every Ukrainian president since independence has visited that statue. As a State Department official, Christina introduced my background. I was in the State Department. And as a State Department official during the time of the demise of the Soviet Union, I remember the concerns that many had in not only experts and think tanks, but those who were following events here in Ukraine. They were concerned about a Ukraine on the brink of independence. Whatever basis there was for these concerns, the Ukrainian people defied expectations and rallied around a unifying vision that fostered national identity and began in the coming decades, I think, to build a strong state allied with the West. In fact, some scholars have argued that Ukraine developed the most mature civil society of any post-Soviet state in the 2 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union. 2 years ago, as you know, Ukrainian people again showed their courage during the Maidan protests and overthrowing a corrupt regime, persevering through very difficult and trying winter months, and charting a new course toward a truly democratic and independent country. And as I remember, the focus and the cause of the Maidan was twofold. One, an association with the European Union, and secondly, an anti-corruption campaign. But going back to the Shevchenko statue, if I may, in Washington, D.C., at the base of the statue is a question that Shevchenko posed in 1857, but yet it's quite timely today. It begins, quote, "When will Ukraine have its Washington?" And by the way, Washington here means George Washington. It's the reference to the father of my nation, the United States, and our first president. But the quote goes on after, "When will Ukraine have its Washington? With fair and just laws. Someday we will," unquote. Well, at the risk of being too optimistic, and I think it's important to be optimistic, at least initially, I believe that someday that Shevchenko foresaw, a Ukraine with fair and just law could be around the corner. Ukraine is blessed with extraordinary opportunity. You have challenges, but you are blessed with also extraordinary opportunity. In the year and a half since the Maidan protests, Ukraine's elected government have put forward some political, economic, and governance reforms. Also was held, some have cast as the freest and fairest elections in Ukraine's history. There was the anti-corruption agencies established, and also there were some talked about long overdue reforms that also in certain areas have been implemented. Ukraine's democratic transition has been interrupted by Russia's aggression. But there's no reason why this conflict and aggression on the eastern part of Ukraine must thwart the country's long-standing drive for a strong, free, and independent country aligned with the West. There was a recent study done by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, and it found that within 5 years of a successful civil resistance movement, like the ones we saw during the Orange Revolution and also the Maidan protests, that a strong majority of countries were able to make the transition to democratic systems that respect rights. So let me, with this backdrop, let me enumerate, to that end, 6 of what I would say are the most important efforts that Ukraine's civil society can undertake and should focus on today to advance Ukraine's transition toward secure, independent democracy. The first is mobilizing civil society. A mature, organized civil society is absolutely crucial in holding national leaders accountable, demanding reform, insisting on good governance. In an active civil society, people take the initiative in voting for competent legislators, forming non-governmental organizations, writing articles, speaking to the media, and even running for office. All of you here, I think today, can be proud of the fact that Ukrainian civil society, to quote a recent Freedom House, if you're familiar with our non-governmental organization, Freedom House, a brief said the following, quote, that Ukrainian civil society is more mobilized than ever, playing a greater role in determining what direction the country takes, and in many ways redefining public life. Independent media have blossomed, with new enterprises growing in strength and shining a light on important social, political, and economic trends, unquote. So my first point and message to you is that you, because looking again around this room, you, civil society, you can make a difference, you can have an impact. You have a lot of power if you use it. The second is continuing to take the path of nonviolent resistance. Ukrainian civil society has thrived because the Ukrainian people, in the face of incredible provocations, have chosen to voice their grievances non-violently, rather than through the use of force. Civil resistance movements require discipline and an extraordinary degree of civic cooperation, even when you have differences, that naturally strengthen the base of civil society and lays the foundation for democracy. Nonviolent action creates a democratic culture, an attitude that ensures a focus not only on relations between governments, but also on the role that average people have on history. Here, I think that the demonstrations in the Maidan underscore this very point that I have made. There was a focus, there was unity of purpose, and from the standpoint of civil society, it was a non-violent demonstration and outspokenness about what was the desire for change. Let me mention a third that's related here. And I share this third with you from my days, the other day and today, in listening to people and a Ukrainian perspective. And that is very much linked to my first point and the second point. Third point is, there should be a dialogue. There should be a what constitutes a national dialogue, a dialogue between government and civil society as to what is the path forward, what can make a difference. I know in the United States, I have, in my capacity when I was in government, I dealt with a lot of challenging issues. And many times, I would sit before NGOs and listen, not NGOs, non-governmental organizations, part of civil society, and listen to their views. Sometimes they would criticize me directly. Sometimes they would say, we don't like what you put forward. How about this? I found that our policies were strengthened because of that exchange, because of that transparency of purpose, because of that critique and that debate over issues. That provides a strong foundation for going forward. I heard that as a suggestion here in Ukraine, and I wrote it down because I wanted to share that tonight with you. I think it's a very good one. So let me mention the fourth. The fourth is promoting economic reform. There's no better example of what privatization and austerity can produce and how it can improve standards of living than the example across the border westward from you in Poland. In their book on the political economy of Poland's transition, the American and Polish economists, John Jackson, Jacek Klich, and Krystyna Poznanska, they compare and contrast the decisions Polish and Ukrainian leaders made after independence. Poland has now outperformed Ukraine in terms of its economic growth, its job creation, and also controlling inflation. So in this report and in this study, they look at why. What were the differences? The two countries' different economic policies were a factor. Namely, Poland pursued a quicker, aggressive implementation of stringent fiscal monetary policies, price and currency liberalization, and privatization of the banking sector. So dialogue and have conversations with your Polish neighbors and ask how their experience with entrepreneurship and liberalization might apply to circumstances here in Ukraine. I think it's always of benefit hearing what are the lessons learned, what experiences might be applicable or not here, what kind of change can make a difference and provide that foundation, firm foundation for going forward. So let me mention the fifth. And the fifth is a very fundamental one, and that is enforcing the rule of law. Ukraine's strong civil society can provide the impetus for fostering accountability, providing checks and balances, and defending basic rights. While Ukraine has had, I think, a commendable record in striving to protect minority rights, much more needs to be done to transition from a system of politicized courts to a genuinely independent judiciary and legal institutions. I want to underscore here how important it is for Ukraine to have a prosecutor general's office which does not obstruct government reform and government reform efforts. You know something, it is not simply enough to have just good laws on the books. Because you will ask, it's good to have them, but it's not good enough. An open, transparent process to arbitrate legal disputes and uphold contracts and property rights will advance genuine rule of law in a society. Corrupt businessmen and politicians have to be rooted out of the process. And it's difficult for any society to transition. Many have achieved this. Your neighbor, Poland, did deal with many similar problems. There are a number of initiatives which could help entrench the rule of law in Ukraine. Let me give you some examples for you, food for thought, but you have to be the ones to decide what works best for you. First, programs for political party development. One takes it for granted there are parties, but it's also, what is a party platform? What's the mandate and how do you achieve it? Internships and fellowships for young Ukrainians at Western media organizations and law schools. Exchange of young scholars and parliamentarians. This kind of dialogue and learning from different experiences can only be beneficial. Our Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, she said, quote, like Ukraine's police force, the Prosecutor General's office has to be reinvented as an institution that serves the citizens of Ukraine. That means it must investigate and successfully prosecute corruption and asset recovery cases, unquote. That was her statement. Her choice of words were interesting. A creation or reinvention of governmental institutions. That's what you should be thinking about. A creation or reinvention of governmental institutions to ensure enforcement of the law is essential. As I began on this point, it's good to have good laws on the books, but enforcement is essential. And 6, demanding action against corruption. There is perhaps no challenge more pressing than here in Ukraine than the scourge of corruption. Those of us who are committed to a democratic Ukraine cannot afford to, we use the term, sugarcoat the problem. In order for it to be resolved, you have to address it directly. Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index ranks Ukraine. Do you know what number it ranks Ukraine? I wonder in this room if anyone knows. Ukraine is ranked 130th in the world. Ukraine is tied with Iran and Nicaragua. And in her remarkable book, Thieves of State, Why Corruption Threatens Global Security, there's a veteran reporter, Sarah Chase, who points to corruption here in Ukraine as a critical reason, she says, why the country remains, in her words, quote, vulnerable to attack. President Poroshenko's decision to sign legislation providing for public financing of political parties, it is a promising step in improving transparency. But the extent to which it is implemented, I believe, will depend on everyone in this regard. Again, it goes back to my point. It's not only the point of good laws and good legislation, but its implementation. Here, civil society, on that one piece of legislation alone, can really be committed to ensuring that there is, in this sector, transparency and accountability. One initiative in particular that Ukrainian citizens, I think, must back to the fullest is the newly created Anti-Corruption Bureau, which, with enough grassroots pressure, could bring genuine change to many of the kinds of habits of the country's political class. We'll hear your thoughts. I have not discussed the issue of international assistance because I firmly believe that regardless, by the way, of how the international community responds, Ukraine's fate will be determined by what Ukrainians do for themselves. I do believe in aid and assistance, and I am a strong supporter of it. But the reason why I emphasize the latter, because again, you are the engine for change. Having worked in the field of international affairs for decades, I can say categorically that the best way to ensure that Ukraine receives debt relief and foreign aid is to demonstrate that Ukraine is serious about taking measures against corruption and implementing the very, very difficult and hard reforms that turn outside aid into a very fruitful long-term investment. Let me give, if you'll permit me, the example of Poland again. Even in a political climate in the United States that now is very skeptical of foreign assistance, both Republicans and Democrats in Congress agree that what are called the Enterprise Fund, and the Enterprise Fund established in Poland was well worth the investment. I don't know how many of you know that term, but let me explain what it is, Enterprise Fund. Poland took this established Enterprise Fund, which initially provided loans for small businesses, privatized it. So the purpose of the Enterprise Fund was to take money to give loans to small businesses, to grow the economy. It was so successful that actually Poland has stopped that assistance for the fund from us, and they've privatized it because it's thriving. And they're now using it to finance many of their own state institutions. I was on the board of what is called the Western NIS Enterprise Fund, which is Moldova, Ukraine, and Belarus. It was the same concept, same idea, which, by the way, did provide to a number of industries here in Ukraine loans for small businesses, which in fact have grown and have done well. But my view is more needs to be done here. Small businesses, grassroots efforts and enterprises can really make a difference in terms of economic growth. The concept of the fund here, it's only a beginning. History has demonstrated time and again that those countries which have grown their economies and significantly enhanced the standard of living for their citizens have undertaken several crucial steps. They have privatized their industries. They have advanced rapid, radical economic reforms requiring the imposition of austerity measures. But for those reforms to be effective and sustainable, anti-corruption measures also have to be put in place. There must be firm political will to ensure that there are not only good laws on the books, but they are enforced fairly and transparently. As I said before, and I want to just underscore again, the existence of an independent functioning judiciary accountable to the population is mandatory. Progress can be achieved when such a foundation is in place. Ukraine's next generation, as you've heard me say several times this evening, it has a key role to play in advancing such crucial change. Civil society in general, non-governmental organizations in particular, are essential in ensuring that all politicians are held accountable to the rule of law. In turn, it's civil society that can foster the needed political will among its leaders to fight and eradicate corruption. I hope you see that linkage. Civil society applies the pressure and enables political leaders to have the will to move forward on this agenda. Civil society activism can bring about a strong transition and economic reforms. I began by mentioning Taras Shevchenko. Let me conclude by referencing Taras Shevchenko again. Taras Shevchenko has a quote which I believe is also quite relevant. It's about the enduring power of freedom. The quote goes, quote, "Our soul shall never perish. Freedom knows no dying, and the greedy cannot harvest fields where seas are lying, cannot bind the living spirit, nor the living world, cannot smirch the sacred glory of the Almighty Lord." The protesters in Maidan held up signs of Shevchenko because they knew that the aspiration of freedom is a guidepost that unites all Ukrainians, regardless of where they live, where they're from, or the language that they speak. In the struggle for a secure democratic Ukraine, remember above all that your voice matters. You are the key to the future of Ukraine. I want to say thank you. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. And Slava Ukraina!
Thank you, Paula. I need to stand here. We have some time for questions. Just a few things before we start. We do have our teammates on the microphones. If you are asking a question, please make sure that you speak into the microphone so that our translator can hear you and translate. And we have a headset for you also.
You know what, would you, I'm going to say, oh, you don't have a headset for me, so I'll hear, okay.
So in case, yeah, so you can ask your questions in Ukrainian or in English. All right, so we can start. Are there any questions for, oh, and the last thing I want to say is when you ask a question, please state your name. Okay, are there any questions?
Or comments.
Or comments.
It doesn't have to be a question. Yes, please.
Microphone? Yeah. Eric Almeida, I'm a U.S. citizen. Your fifth point concerned the Prosecutor General's office and the need for reinvention of that SEER law enforcement. I agree, as an outsider. My question is, why, in your view, is that taken so long? It's been 2 years now since the revolution. I realize it's still a work in progress, but it's been very halting progress in that domain. So my question is, why, in your view, is it so halting?
It seems that there hasn't been political will to make that change, and my answer, as in my comment, was you need to have two things happening. I'm looking at you, you know, or you're an American, but you, meaning in this audience, that civil society activism does matter. In the United States, by the way, when there's slow progress, as you know, people get out, they complain, they critique. So you have a role to play. So there has to be political will, but there also has to be activism in holding politicians and those in those positions accountable. It has to be both. It hasn't happened, but my view is, I understand that change is about to happen, and that's good. But it has to move forward from there.
I think we have one question here in the front. There's a...
Oh, the mic's there. It's there.
Доброго дня, Костянтин Бідовой. Питання таке. Я на 90% згоден з усім, що від вас почув. Але в нас в країні, я хочу донести свою думку до вас і запитати. От дивіться, в нас є таке порочне коло. Тобто, олігархічні клани породили політичні партії. Політичні партії – це в кращому випадку такі собі акціонерне товариство, а в гіршому – це організовані злочинні угрупування. І вони не хочуть змін. Яке до вас прохання? Донесіть до інтелектуалів, яких ви сьогодні представляєте, Сполучених Штатів, думку про те, що фінансова розвідка Сполучених Штатів може бути більш ефективною, ніж наші активісти, бо нас не чують. А ви можете на саме святе для них напасти на гроші, які вони відмивають і ховають поза межами України. Скажіть, будь ласка, чи є у вас важелі впливу на цю ситуацію, щоб посилити саме по той бік кордону контроль і запобігати, ефективно протидіяти відмиванню преступних доходів, отриманих на території України вже в західному світі? Дякую.
Well, let me answer this question in several ways. First, I think, if you don't mind my saying, and you said you agreed with me 90%, we have 10% slight difference. So on the slight difference, I go back to thinking about what you achieved in the Orange Revolution. You turned around an original election, and you said that election originally in 2004 was not fair. It needed to be redone. It was. You have power. In Maidan, you also said that we want an association with the European Union, and we are very concerned about corruption. You achieved a number of changes. I don't need to tell anyone in this room what those immediate changes were. You know what they were. Now, he mentioned the time since. Where are we now? I'm sorry to say, I would not look. We can be supporters, but you have to be the ones to hold your leaders accountable. You have to be the one to try to search out, have what arguments you want to make. You know it best here than anyone else. Anyone else. And towards that end, that's where activism really has great power and can really make a difference. And it might not bring about change initially. You know that for the Maidan, people were demonstrating for a very difficult period. There were lives lost. I don't need to say that to you. Some 6,000, I'm thinking on the eastern Ukraine, 6,000, but here there were 100, some lives lost. So I will say that, again, don't always look at what someone else. You have to be the ones to stand strong and really make sure that your leaders are accountable to you. It might sound, as I say this, like I'm giving you a slogan. I don't believe it's a slogan. When I think about my own country and the kind of changes that have been made, and we're still making changes, it's because of demonstrations, it's because of activism, it's because voters vote out the people that they don't want in positions. And I'm only giving a few examples of many. So in this particular case, I think that it comes back to civil society and civil society activism. I think you have to look at and set forth a mandate of what you want and how you're going to achieve it.
Right, I think we have one question here in the back.
Oh, you?
Мене звуть Руслан, я з Луганська, я біженець IDP з Луганська, Руслан. Нас лишили права голосувати.
Sorry, I don't, excuse me, okay. I didn't hear, okay.
2 million people.
You're going to speak in English?
You can speak in Ukrainian, we needed a minute.
Yeah.
All right, sorry.
2 мільйони людей нам заборонили голосувати за владу. Ми вже 2 роки потерпаємо, і ми не маємо можливості її змінити або щось їм сказати. Ні на державному рівні, ні на місцевому. Громада, чи може нам допомагає, але ми не є членами громади. Вже 2 роки 2 мільйони людей. Ми потерпаємо, немає житла, немає їжі, немає роботи. Діти голодують. Якщо є можливість вам, скажіть людям, тут є представники влади, що нам робити? Ми хочемо, тут знаходяться люди, які відчувають себе українцями, ідентифікують як українці, і вже 2 роки потерпають, і ми ніхто. Нам потрібна допомога.
I'm going to mention 3 things. First, the situation in the eastern Ukraine and the result of that aggression. as you mentioned, now 2 million internally displaced persons. First, let me mention, some of your legislators, and it wasn't one single party, but it was a mix, a group of different party members, first came to the United States, and you're worrying about what our US, so came to the United States and said, I start with this first point, and said, you know, we have these internally displaced persons. They came with photographs, slides, and by the way, they were all women legislators, I will tell you. They were very articulate and they made a very, very compassionate appeal. In the United States, I will tell you at the time I heard this, I don't think people, not the policymakers, but think tanks, different NGOs, knew the scale or the scope of the internally displaced persons. When they personally, firsthand, delivered that appeal, I thought it was very important. So one, I want to mention, you do have legislators who are speaking to this issue and striving to get awareness internationally and support. In this case, some political support, but mostly humanitarian support. Let me tell you the second. The second is that also you've had not just legislators, but you've had many Ukrainian organizations go to Europe, and in Europe, what they have achieved, what they have done, is to also elevate that issue. Why does that matter? Because you know, on the headlines in many newspapers in Europe, it's about Syrian refugees and the refugee crisis and how it will be dealt with. But you raise a very important issue. Here is Ukraine on the continent of Europe, and you have 2 million people who are displaced, internally displaced. It doesn't produce a stable or secure or prosperous environment for the country and for you personally, no less your neighbors. So secondly, I want to mention that that also has been an effort, because you asked me what can be done and what should be done. And same thing, not just aid, but political, because you also raised the issue of the politics of it, about being included in election and having rights. Thirdly, I will say, I keep in touch. Sorry?
Ми не можемо голосувати.
Sorry.
Ми не можемо голосувати за цих людей.
Yes, no, I was about, I'm coming to the third, but I want to give a full answer, a comprehensive answer. Because by the way, it is about voting, but it's also about your welfare too. I mean, I would assume. So my third point is, I will tell you, at least as I hear it, there is a discussion within your parliament, within the Rada, and discussing this very issue of the rights and the right to vote. So back to the point, as my answer to him, this gentleman in the front. Again, we can express our views, but you're here. It is important that you indicate that that matters to you. If you don't, so your legislators have been speaking to the humanitarian issue and to the voting rights issue. Secondly, I will say this from the standpoint, I'm not with the US government, but I know that the US government has spoken to this issue. And also there are a number of European governments that have spoken to this issue. Why? Because to have, again, a stable, prosperous, and democracy, you want to have everybody have the right to vote. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, I believe, has had some difficulty in being able to access areas that they want to access in eastern Ukraine. They too have spoken to this issue. So my answer, again, to you, I think you have the support, certainly from the US, certainly from Europe, but Also, you have to make sure that your voice is very loud on this issue as well. Really.
We have a question here in the front.
Дякую. Дуже дякую вам за вашу лекцію. Це все було дуже цікаво і виникло таке питання. Мене звуть Володимир Короленко, я лікар, організатор охорони здоров'я. Питання в мене таке. Всім відомо про те, що в Сполучених Штатах наразі відбувається масштабна реформа в охороні здоров'я, яка був такий навіть випадок, що спричинила певний колапс і владних структур через те, що це дуже великі фінансові реформи йдуть. З другого боку, останнього року я почув заяви деяких лідерів скандинавських країн, які кажуть про згортання своїх соціальних програм. І от чому я про це кажу? Питання. Зараз у нас в Україні система охорони здоров'я не в найкращому стані, потребує реформ і фінансування в тому числі. І мова йшла сьогодні про рецепт, в тому числі економічні обмеження, які самі по собі не можуть сприяти. Тому що громадське здоров'я забезпечувалось на дуже високому рівні. І тут виникає питання, як би ви порадили, на якому рівні має бути соціальність держави, наскільки держава має бути соціальною наша? Дякую.
Well, it is hard for me to comment on your question because I do not know well the healthcare situation in Ukraine. I don't. So my answer to you is not necessarily an answer to your question, because again, I don't have the information in this, but I want to give you at least an answer that will give you food for thought on process. And you can determine what I say that might fit here or not. In the United States, when our president came forward with as they have the Obama health care plan, there was a lot of debate and discussion. So the first, by the way, very, very vigorous debate. Some people saying, I do not like what he proposes, it undercuts the Constitution and constitutional rights. There were other people who said, finally, this is what we want. We like his proposal, it will change the system, but this is what we want. So what happened? There was a very, very, very dynamic, outspoken, vibrant debate. Secondly, you don't have here the term we use states in the United States, you know, the state of California, the state of Virginia. You have different areas. The term has been used, oblasts, but let me say, do you know that on the healthcare issue, there were, I think, close to maybe 20 states that protested. The states protested and said, we will not go for this legislation. We, at the local level, know what's best for our own citizens. Because what we do in our state is different from the other state. Why would I want the federal government to tell me what to do? So it was very localized. Then that decision went before our Supreme Court. I mentioned to you the importance of rule of law. So it went right up to the Supreme Court. And in this case, by the way, on certain aspects of this, President Obama succeeded in what he wanted to achieve. Also, our members of Congress, really tough fight. We're fighting and sparring over this. So, not knowing your situation, what I will say to you, and what you should think about, and not just only on this issue, I see Ukraine as a united whole, all of Ukraine, even the area that unfortunately you have displaced people in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. And in this context, I think it is for Ukraine as a whole to debate these issues, because what might work in one part may not be exactly the same as another. But you have to have the local areas give their voice, all, but also the center. It has to be connected. And that's what we did. There was a good debate, a good discussion, and I think, you know, some liked it, some didn't like it. So that's what democracy is all about. It has its challenges, it has its risks. It's not always a perfect picture. But if you don't have that debate and discussion, your views will never be represented. And that's why I know I'm repeating myself this evening, but if there's one message as you go out that door that I'd like you to remember is that each and every one of you have a role to play. Don't think that you don't have a role to play. You do. Whether you're a doctor, whether you're a businessman, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're an elected official, we have some elected officials here, you definitely have a role to play. Media has a role to play. You have to have that debate. So sorry I can't comment on healthcare, but I want to at least give you at least the idea of process.
This gentleman here.
Олег Бринін, я адвокат, громадська організація «Київська Слобідка». Оскільки рідко таких гостей можна почути, як ви, тому я буду так ставити більш проблемні запитання. Скажіть, будь ласка, повністю погоджуюся з тим, що в своєму домі ми повинні самі наводити порядок, в тому числі і з корупцією, і громадянське суспільство, і ми будемо старатися. Але, як ви чудово розумієте, при наявному зубожінні більшої частини населення активність громадянського суспільства, вона є практично нульовою. Вона зводиться до десятків людей, які можуть щось зробити, пікетувати, десь виступати. Тобто вони реального впливу не можуть зробити на владу. Що ми і зараз спостерігаємо, коли не насильницьки ми щось стараємося донести, просто будь-яка державна інституція ігнорує це, і вислуховує і ігнорує. Ненасильницька, так би мовити, толерантна демократія якраз і співставляється з ненасильницькою дипломатією. Що хотілося б від ваших інституцій, міжнародних, в тому числі американських, коли наші президенти приїжджають, я розумію, я не беру до уваги таких, як Янукович, той же Ющенко, Порошенко, то не хотілося б, щоб ви парламентом, конгресом вставали і зустрічали, і нічого не говорили, тому що будь-який, нехай навіть мінімальний корупційний скандал з вашим президентом неминуче привів би до його відставки. А ваші міжнародні інституції на це все у нас закривають очі повністю, не ігнорують. І що стосується виступу із Луганська, де є 2 мільйони біженців і багато загибших людей, тисяч загибших, скажіть, будь ласка, коли б президент Кравчук в свій час поставив питання американцям, коли приймався Будапештський меморандум, які гарантували безпеку і цілісність держави, і вони були основним ініціатором цього меморандуму відмови від ядерної зброї. Коли б Кравчук спитав, ви гарантуєте безпеку, яким чином ви будете гарантувати, якщо на нас хтось нападе і захопить нашу територію? І Америка відповіла, ми, звичайно, введемо санкції, не будемо давати кошти певні і так далі. І будемо вам допомагати гуманітарною допомогою. Як ви думаєте, Кравчук погодився ядерну зброю віддати на таку умову, що якщо вас хтось захопить, ми ведемо проти тої країни санкції? Завтра Туреччина може ще забрати якусь територію, там Польща, Румунія претендує на якісь там території етнічні. Тож санкції виводити проти тих країн і нічого не робити. Як ви вважаєте? Дякую.
I agree. I wrote an op-ed that was published in the United States in a publication called USA Today. And you know what the title of it was? Ukraine regrets giving up its nuclear weapons. So I will tell you that my own personal view is, and I'm going to work backwards, starting with your last point, on the Budapest Memorandum, that was, as we know, a protocol among a number of countries. It was Russia, the United States, the UK. Yes, and you know. All right. So of course you know. So in this case, clearly it undercut. You gave your nuclear weapons, and here, what happens? You're vulnerable, and you are attacked, and there should be accountability. By the way, my view, and I am a proponent, by the way, as is our Congress. Our Congress has supported providing the request made by the Ukrainian government was help us defend ourselves. My view is, yes, the United States and the West should help Ukraine defend itself and provide the kind of military assistance that has been requested. That hasn't happened because there's a difference in the United States, on that issue. But my view is one that, for the reasons you stated, going back to the Budapest Memorandum. But I want to add something here for all of you, because you may not realize this. When that happened, that also has ramifications, meaning what happened, the aggression, Crimea, the illegal annexation of Crimea, and also the aggression in eastern Ukraine, but especially the undercutting of the Budapest Memorandum. Basically and specifically, when we have these discussions of nuclear non-proliferation, by the way, Russia is part of that discussion. And so a question is, and I've seen it in press in Asia, the Asians will say, what happens to deterrence? If there isn't deterrence and some kind of strength in deterring aggression, what will it mean for us in this case? And Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. My point is, you said you're a lawyer. On legal grounds, I believe there's justification. And secondly, on the grounds of dealing with nuclear non-proliferation. Also, it undercuts that whole effort because if one doesn't uphold the terms of the Budapest Memorandum. You raised a second issue in your earlier comments that I want to address. I have mentioned to all of you the importance of civil society and civic action. But let me say, it isn't to the exclusion of support from the West and from your friends and long-standing allies in this case. The gentleman who asked the question about the internally displaced persons, that's why I flipped the question and started with the legislators coming to the United States first, because they wanted support from us, political support and humanitarian support. You mentioned the economic situation. You can't do it alone. I mentioned in my remarks the importance of foreign assistance. I think it's important, but it has to be targeted, and there has to be a collaboration with you on how that is targeted and how it can really benefit civil society and benefit change here in Ukraine. So you're quite right on both points. Diplomatic engagement, humanitarian engagement, and that kind of assistance and support is crucial, and I'm a strong believer that that has to be the case.
We have time for one more question. Sorry.
Good evening, my name is Taras Berezovets, and I'm actually from Crimea, and I run an NGO
Wait, sorry.
No,
Okay, start again.
Yeah, my
And
name
would you
is
tell me
Taras.
who you are, because I'm not hearing
I'm
everything.
originally from Crimea,
Okay.
and I run an NGO which is called Free Crimea.
Oh, you're speaking English. I apologize. I was asking you if you're speaking English and I didn't hear your answer and I put this
So
thing on.
once again, my name is
Okay,
Taras Berezovets.
my apologies.
I'm from Crimea, I run an NGO which is called Free Crimea. And my question is very simple. Nothing could happen like this in Ukrainian peninsula, Ukrainian Donbass, unless there was so huge and so massive Russian propaganda. To this day, Kremlin spends nearly $1.5 billion per year for propaganda itself. The sole TV station Russia Today costs to Russian budget $220 million, and it's not that big money for Mr. Putin. In times of President Ronald Reagan, who was probably one of most favorite presidents among Ukrainian, US government had a program which was called Crusade for Freedom, which was not so costly for US budget. But still we had, and I remember I was listening myself to Radio Liberty, to Voice of America, and it was just Voice of Freedom. And nothing could happen like this not only in Ukraine, but in other parts of Europe, because recently I was in Estonia, and Estonia having the same problem because they have a huge Russian-speaking population in cities like Narva, Kohtla-Yare, so-called Russian-speaking population is about 90%. And the danger of hybrid warfare to these countries is absolutely clear. And I cannot explain myself why American foreign policy in terms of informational war, in terms of tackling this propaganda, it has never been so toothless. It's absolutely nonsense that Kremlin doesn't have any sort of match in the face of the United States. And the question is very simple. Is there going to be anything after presidential elections, or we would see just the same absolutely toothless politics as we saw from President Obama? Thank you.
Right. Thank you for your question. 2 points I'd make. First, and also to be clear, you know I'm not with the US government, but let me give my own personal view. My own personal view is I agree with you, and the importance of engagement, the importance of information in this case. The radios have made a difference. You yourself just mentioned how you got and get your own information from the radios. I do think that we are in a new environment, and in this context that an investment in that area is absolutely crucial. I am part of a think tank that is the Atlantic Council. I'm on the board and the executive committee. And if you have the benefit of seeing any of the materials that the Atlantic Council puts together, it puts together some really very striking data. For example, Boris Nemtsov, as you know, was murdered. And the day after he was walking in the Kremlin, near the Kremlin, that next day there was to be a demonstration as well as interviews with mothers, fathers of Russian soldiers in eastern Ukraine. The title of the report related to what's called hiding in plain sight. And there are Russian activists who have brought this forward. Why am I sharing this? Because that's just one aspect. That's in the case of Russia and the knowledge base in Russia or lack thereof. But you are right. It does really matter in terms of information and having a counter-information strategy, making sure that populations know what the facts are on the ground and what is exactly going on. That provides a strong base for any policy and any action. So 1, I agree with you. 2, I've written about it also, just like on the other case with the Budapest Memorandum, and where I've said that an investment should be made in that area. It's not just only about military, and it's not only about economic. There is an information warfare that's going on. Thirdly, you asked about the elections. For those of you in the US, for those of you who follow elections in the US, if you could tell me what's going on, I want to know. Because honestly, our elections right now, it's just no one knows. And it's hard for me to answer your question, seriously, in terms of predicting what candidate will emerge and what mandate that particular candidate will put forward with regard to this specific question. But I can at least say 3 things. 1, I do feel confident in saying that, and this is not a statement about a future president, I do feel confident in saying that you do have a very strong political support in the United States, certainly in our legislative branch, certainly in our communities, and not just the diaspora. And from that standpoint, I think you can count on this strong voice of the importance of these issues. And then secondly, I'd also say you matter. You matter. You're a big country. You're located at the crossroads of Europe. You matter, and you are in a very critical moment. And finally and thirdly, you didn't ask this, but you know one thing, that there are many who have the policy relevant to Crimea. You remember the policy, the US policy toward the Baltic states? It was a policy of non-recognition, a non-recognition of the forced incorporation of the 3 Baltic states. And in this case, there's the view and support for non-recognition of the illegal annexation of Crimea. So I feel that there is strong support regardless of who comes out here.
Thank you.
Thank you
you,
very
Paula.
much. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us this evening, for all your comments and questions. On your way out, we will have the box with the headset, so please make sure you drop them off. Tomorrow evening we're having another event, and Paula Dobriansky will be back, this time with John Hurst and Adrian Karadnitsky and the current U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt. So please join us for that panel discussion on U.S.-Ukrainian relations.
And by the way, if I could say this, the last question, because his question was about policy, your question, the panel tomorrow is going to be really addressing these very issues, by the way. Okay?
What time is it?
It's same time, same time, same place. Same time, same
See you
place.
there.